As a prologue and also as a quick disclaimer, I asked the person who goes by the name the Shepherd King, are you a member of the ISUPK, and if so, are you a ranked member? He answered in the affirmative. However, unfortunately, he quickly deleted his comment, so I don't know what to make of that, so this disclaimer therefore may be necessary. But what he initially wrote to me was Khan, Kwadazayan Chamashyam, which means in Lashawan Qadash, yes, officer of 50, or in proper Hebrew, Ken, Katsin Hamishim. So just wanted to put that out there because he wrote that. This video moves forward under the assumption that the man is how he identified as, which is as an officer of 50 in the ISUPK. Greetings. About 2.5 weeks ago, I had a video titled An ISUPK Officer Types in Lashawan Qadash. I mentioned that video because I'm going to be returning to the subject of that video, which was a gentleman who happened to be a officer of 50 in the ISUPK, in the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge. But first, let me give a little background as to how I arrived at this subject, why I decided to do a video on this. I was watching a video that Vocab put out yesterday titled Live with ISUPK Houston, as he had met up with some members of the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge and spoke with them yesterday and aired his discussion live. And there was a portion where one of the members declared that they know ancient Hebrew, they speak ancient Hebrew, they write ancient Hebrew. But when Vocab tried to engage them in the subject, they were reluctant to discuss it. Here, take a look at this brief clip, which is a little bit less than 2 minutes long.
Man, listen, you can read my book all you want to. You'll never get it.
You write this? Do you speak Greek?
Do I speak Greek?
Yeah, your book.
I speak ancient Hebrew. What the hell are you talking about?
You speak ancient Hebrew?
I speak ancient Hebrew, write ancient Hebrew.
So if I show you Paleo Hebrew, you'll be able to translate it to me?
You can show me shit right there on the cement.
Yeah.
Right, you can do a type right there. You're not going to come over here with the tongue that you all got, speaking smooth words. Man, y'all will never get in the kingdom, man. Not here.
Right.
Not here, right.
So if Jesus spoke your language of the ancient Hebrew, then why on the cross did he say, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? Eli, Eli is my God, my God.
Man, I know what it is.
What would you say, though? You would say,
I would say,
in your language, you would say,
this is what I would say. Because y'all see y'all mind so small. That's what it's supposed to be.
all you do is insult and you ain't really getting in the text.
No, listen.
Let's get in the text.
I'm not trying to teach you.
Yeah, all you can do is insult. That's all you got?
you.
That's all you got?
Insult.
Yeah, your mind is small, this and that. Let's get in the text. Why did Jesus say, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani? Why didn't he say your word? What's your word from my God?
Listen. Here we go. Okay, now listen, you're going to let me answer that, right?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay, cool. Now, no matter what you say,
right,
or how you try to position it, the Most High God is only for the children of Israel.
Okay.
Hold on, I'm not done yet. No matter what language you want to try to pull or whatever, you'll never be able to come up on the camp and try to come up with any fast talkers you train in. You understand that, right? Our mind, we don't have a mark. You know what I'm saying? And we don't love heathen nations.
Right.
So we can go back and forth. But when you come to the real camp, the original camp, ISUPK, we ain't got no love for no heathens, no matter what you say.
Yeah, I know you don't have any love. I know that, because you're your father, the devil.
Man, the look on that guy's face when Vocab said that. Anyway, putting that aside, as I alluded to before playing that clip, what caught my attention was the fact that the guy came out the gate feigning real confidence about his knowledge of the language, his ability to speak it and read it and write it. But once Vocab tried to engage him on the subject, he clearly didn't want to discuss it. He tried to change the topic. He was essentially engaging in obfuscation. And that's interesting because the leader of his group has alluded to people being afraid to get into the language.
Why are you running from the Hebrew? You let them on the internet scare you from the Lashawan Qadash. Right, they say Lashawan Qadash, that ain't right. That ain't right.
But anyway, seeing that made me want to make a video on the group and on their use of the language, as there's a question that I've had in my mind that I've wanted to ask members of the group for a short while now. And that question is, how do you spell Johanna in Hebrew? Now, initially, that question might seem simple enough, but the reality is that it might be a lot more complex than people realize, whether they're proponents of Lashawan Qadash or not. So you see, most Lashawan Qadash names, when you see them transliterated into the Latin script, it's easy to figure out what the Hebrew text is behind that, what characters they would use to spell it. But there's certain instances, especially with much older names, where there's sort of an open question and there's even indications of misspelling. So in the case of the name Johanna, there's a variety of ways that it could be spelled, and I would therefore like to discuss how the name is spelled with members of the ISUPK or even with Johanna himself. So I thought of one person who might be willing to tell me how the name is spelled, and that was the person who was the subject of my video. An ISUPK officer types in Lashawan Qadash. So I went back to where I first encountered that person, which was in the comment section of Vocab's video titled Hebrew Israelite Language Debunked. And so here was the question that I posed to him, quote, "By the way, the Shepherd King, could you tell me how Johanna, the name of the leader of your group, is written in Hebrew?" End quote. And here's what he wrote back to me. Now, for those who don't know or don't remember, in my first video about this person, it focused on the fact that he engaged in a curious practice where he would take English sentences and run them through an app which translated them into modern Israeli Hebrew, and then he would retype those sentences or those phrases into the Phoenician script to give the impression that he knew how to write, complex sentences and paragraphs in Lashawan Qadash. But it was clear that he didn't understand what he was retyping, and unfortunately we see more of that in this latest response from him. For example, as was discussed in the first video, it's still the case now that he confuses the mem sofit, the final mem, with the samech. For example, he declares that, this thing is all around the world, but for world, he writes haolas instead of haolam. But that's minor. More significant is this first sentence, this opening sentence of his comment, which reads, Ata otsar milim matzhik meod, which translates to you, otsar milim, are very funny. Now, he called me otsar milim, which literally means treasure of words. So otsar means treasure and milim means words. Now the question is, why did he call me that? I think, here's my guess, he was referring to vocab. Whether he thought I was vocab, or he was saying something like you and vocab are funny, or you vocab are funny, or you and vocab is funny, or something like that. Whatever the case, he put the word vocab into his little modern Hebrew Israeli translator, his app that he uses to translate English into modern Hebrew, and his little application treated vocab as vocabulary and gave him back the modern Israeli Hebrew phrase, otsar milim. But let's consider this phrase, otsar milim. The word otsar means treasure, and milim means words. So both these terms within the phrase, otsar milim, each individual term is indeed a Hebrew word. However, the combination of the two words put together, otsar milim, treasure of words, or more figuratively, vocabulary, using this phrase to refer to vocabulary happened under the influence of German. As in German, the word Wortschatz means vocabulary, but what it literally means is word treasure, Wortschatz. And so this Hebrew neologism, otsar milim, this combination of the word for treasure and a word for meaning words, treasure of words, was constructed with a German term in mind. Upon seeing this, the first thing that came to mind for me was Lashawan Qadash is basically Paleo Yiddish. Now, I understand that's a bit flippant, a bit satirical, but the point is that when I see a proponent of Lashawan Qadash unwittingly take a modern Hebrew neologism, which is influenced by a German combination of words, and then recast it in the Phoenician script to pass it off as Lashawan Qadash, the phrase Paleo Yiddish is the first thing that comes to mind for me. And I see this sort of thing happen quite a bit. I'm probably going to make more videos on the subject to catalog instances of such happening, but what I'm referring to is there are many instances where proponents of Lashawan Qadash will take a few Hebrew terms, put them through a Lashawan Qadash pronunciation, and then plug them into their own Anglophone mindset, basically into an Anglophone English matrix that exists in their mind. So even though they're using the ancient Phoenician script, the so-called Paleo Hebrew script, it's still a case where Semitic terms are being supplanted onto basically a Germanic, a Teutonic matrix. And if anything, that's essentially a parallel to Yiddish. And that's why the phrase Paleo Yiddish comes to mind. Before I close, I'll give another example of this coming from the same person, the same officer from the ISUPK. Notice that at the beginning he declares "Ze nikra lishmor alau amiti," which literally means this is called to guard on it real or true. But what he was trying to say is this is called keeping it real. I'm confident that he put that American English phrase, this is called keeping it real, into his his application or program that he uses to translate English sentences into modern Israeli Hebrew, and that's what he got back. Ze nikra lishmor alau amiti. And even though he had an application or a program help him construct the actual structure of the sentence, I think it's still a pretty clear example of someone trying to plug Semitic terms into an Anglophone matrix, a Teutonic matrix. And by the way, he also used the word profil, which I hope is clear is not a Hebrew word. That he plugged in, he made a sentence that accused me of using a fake profile of something to the effect of forged profile, and his application translated the word profile into the modern Hebrew word profil, which I think is obviously a loan word from a European language. And, this becomes ironic because so many of the criticisms that proponents of Lashawan Qadash launch against modern Israeli Hebrew also apply to Lashawan Qadash itself. Their criticisms are somewhat superficial, but nonetheless, they can capitalize on very real criticisms of modern Israeli Hebrew, like, for example, that in many cases, you have people who have a sort of Germanic or English mindset, Anglophone mindset, or a Yiddish phone mindset, whatever, and they're constructing sentences with that sort of syntax in the back of their mind, plugging Hebrew terms into basically that sort of Germanic or Teutonic matrix. And that really does happen in modern Israeli Hebrew because it was adopted by a huge number of English speakers and Yiddish speakers, people who essentially speak Germanic languages. Aside from that, the other thing, obviously, there were a number of neologisms which were created for modern Israeli Hebrew because, there's countless terms in modernity that ancient Hebrew didn't have a word for. So you had to create neologisms, and then that was when the language was being developed sort of artificially by scholars like Eliezer ben Yehuda, scholars in Hebreus who could sit down and think about a Hebrew term that could be constructed for a modern concept. But then that's the artificial growth of the language, or the artificial development of the language. But then as modern Israeli Hebrew developed naturally, what happened is that it very quickly just started grabbing loan words, because the average person is not going to sit down and think of a Hebrew equivalent. A lot of times they just absorb words from other languages to capture concepts that are already discussed in other languages. And so of course there's a ton of loan words in modern Israeli Hebrew as well. And what we see is this is now happening with Lashawan Qadash. There are many cases where people are basically just plugging Hebrew terms into their own Anglophone matrix, as I've already said it several times. And then there's other instances where they're creating neologisms, and and then now we even see instances of them just grabbing words from other languages. There's loan words, and that sort of happens naturally. And so, honestly, the criticisms of modern Israeli Hebrew apply just as much to Lashawan Qadash. We just don't see it on as much of a grand a scale with Lashawan Qadash because, frankly, nobody speaks it. Just about almost nobody tries to employ it. If you had a situation where millions of people were speaking it from birth as their first language, from childhood, not birth obviously, but from childhood as their first language, as their native tongue, then we would get many more examples of this sort of evolution. The neologisms, the borrowed terms, and the syntax from other languages and so forth. And so That's all I wanted to say in this. I look forward to discussing with others. I think as time goes on, I'm likely going to make more videos on this subject. Until then, I hope everybody enjoyed this video. It's a very short one, but either way, God bless.